Good day, friends, and welcome back to Conflicts of the Human Race. Today, I will tell you about the entire story of the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-1871. Now buckle up as we begin. In the summer of 1870, Europe stood on the precipice of monumental change. Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of Prussia, had orchestrated a masterful diplomatic trap that would ensnare Napoleon III's France in a war that would reshape the continent forever. The catalyst came in the form of a Spanish succession crisis, where a Hohenzollern prince was offered the Spanish throne. France, fearing Prussian encirclement, demanded guarantees that no Hohenzollern would ever accept the Spanish crown. When King Wilhelm I of Prussia politely declined to give such assurances during a meeting at the Spa town of Ems, Bismarck seized his moment. He edited the diplomatic telegram describing the encounter, making it appear that both monarchs had insulted each other, then released it to the press. The doctored Ems dispatch spread across Europe like wildfire, inflaming public opinion in both France and Prussia. In Paris, crowds gathered in the streets demanding war, their patriotic fervor whipped into a frenzy by newspapers proclaiming national honor had been insulted. Napoleon III, despite his failing health and private reservations, found himself politically cornered. His regime, built on the legacy of his uncle's military glory, could not appear weak before Prussian provocation. On July 15, 1870, the French Legislative Assembly voted for war credits, and Napoleon III began mobilizing his armies. The emperor believed his forces, battle-tested in the Crimea, Italy, and Mexico, would swiftly defeat the Prussians and restore French prestige. However, the French military was woefully unprepared for a major European war. Their chassepot rifles were superior to Prussian needle guns, but their artillery was inferior, their logistics chaotic, and their command structure confused. Meanwhile, Bismarck's diplomatic genius bore fruit as the southern German states honored their military alliances with Prussia. As France declared war on July 19, 1870, the Prussian military machine, honed by decades of reform and recent victories over Austria, swung into action with terrifying efficiency. General Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, chief of the Prussian General Staff, had spent years planning for this exact scenario. His revolutionary use of railways and telegraph communications allowed for the rapid mobilization of over 400,000 troops along the Rhine frontier. The Prussian army was divided into three powerful forces: the First Army under General Karl von Steinmetz, the Second Army under Prince Frederick Charles, and the Third Army commanded by Crown Prince Frederick William. Each army moved with clockwork precision toward the French border, supported by contingents from Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden. The German forces possessed superior Krupp steel artillery that would prove devastatingly effective against French fortifications. French mobilization, by contrast, was plagued by confusion and delay. Units arrived at concentration points without proper supplies, officers couldn't locate their commands, and the promised 400,000 men materialized as barely 200,000 ill-equipped soldiers. The first major clash came at Spicheren on August 2, 1870, where French forces under General Charles Auguste Frossard held strong defensive positions on the heights above Saarbrücken. The battle began when advanced Prussian units encountered French outposts in the morning mist, escalating into a full engagement that neither side had initially planned. French chasseurs, armed with their excellent breech-loading chassepot rifles, inflicted heavy casualties on attacking Prussian infantry. For hours, the outcome remained in doubt, as French troops held their elevated positions with determination. However, Prussian tactical flexibility and superior artillery coordination gradually turned the tide. As more Prussian units arrived throughout the day, they began flanking the French positions while their Krupp guns pounded the French lines from multiple directions. By evening, the French position became untenable. Despite fighting courageously, Frossard's men were forced to retreat toward Metz, leaving behind their artillery and supplies. The Battle of Spicheren revealed both French tactical skill and strategic vulnerability. While individual French units fought magnificently, their overall coordination was poor, and they lacked the reserves necessary to exploit their initial advantages. Simultaneously with Spitzeren, another crucial engagement unfolded at Worth in Alsace, where Crown Prince Frederick William's Third Army encountered Marshal Patrice MacMahon's forces in a meeting engagement that would seal the fate of eastern France. MacMahon, one of France's most experienced commanders, had positioned his army near the village of Worth, intending to advance into Germany the following day. However, Prussian reconnaissance units made contact with French outposts at dawn on August 2, triggering a battle neither commander had planned. The fighting quickly intensified as both sides fed more troops into the engagement. French cuirassiers, resplendent in their steel breastplates, launched desperate cavalry charges against Prussian artillery positions, only to be cut down by concentrated rifle fire. The Bavarian Corps, fighting alongside Prussian units, proved their worth in fierce village fighting. Despite determined French resistance and several successful counterattacks, the overwhelming numbers and superior coordination of the German forces gradually wore down MacMahon's army. By afternoon, the French were in full retreat toward Chalons, abandoning Alsace to the invaders. The twin defeats at Spitzeren and Worth shattered French morale and opened the path to the French heartland. The disasters at Spitzeren and Worth sent shockwaves through France and fundamentally altered the strategic situation. Napoleon III, his health deteriorating rapidly from kidney stones, struggled to maintain control over his crumbling military position. The emperor faced a terrible dilemma. His army of the Rhine under Marshal Bazaine was falling back toward the fortress of Metz, while MacMahon's battered forces retreated toward Chalons. With Prussian armies pouring across the frontier and Paris in panic, Napoleon III made the fateful decision to take personal command of a new army of Chalons, hoping to restore French fortunes through imperial leadership. Meanwhile, Bismarck's diplomatic web tightened around France as European powers declared neutrality, leaving the French diplomatically isolated. The Prussian advance continued relentlessly as Moltke's armies converged on two primary objectives: trapping Bazaine's forces at Metz and preventing any junction between the separated French armies. French attempts to coordinate their scattered forces were hampered by poor communications and conflicting orders from Paris. The government of Émile Ollivier fell as public confidence collapsed, replaced by a new administration under General Cousin Montauban. But political changes could not reverse military realities. As August progressed, Marshal Achille Bazaine found his army of the Rhine increasingly trapped around the fortress city of Metz, with Prussian forces tightening their grip like a vice. Bazaine, a veteran of campaigns in Algeria, Mexico, and the Crimea, commanded nearly 180,000 troops, France's largest and most experienced army. However, his defensive mindset and cautious nature proved disastrous in the rapidly evolving strategic situation. On August 14, Bazaine attempted to break out toward Verdun, but was intercepted by Prussian forces at Colominuili. The resulting battle demonstrated both the courage of French soldiers and the futility of their strategic position. French infantry, fighting from well-prepared positions, inflicted heavy casualties on attacking Prussian units throughout the day. However, superior Prussian artillery and the gradual arrival of reinforcements forced Bazaine to withdraw back toward Metz by evening. The failed breakout attempt sealed the fate of the army of the Rhine. Within days, Prussian siege lines completely encircled Metz, trapping Bazaine's entire force. This massive encirclement removed France's most powerful army from active operations, leaving Napoleon III and MacMahon with insufficient forces to defend the approaches to Paris. With Bazaine trapped at Metz, pressure mounted on Napoleon III and Marshal MacMahon to attempt a relief operation that would rescue the encircled army and restore French military fortunes. Against his better military judgment, MacMahon was ordered by Paris to march his army of Chalons northeastward toward the Belgian frontier, hoping to circle around the Prussian armies and reach Metz from an unexpected direction. This movement, dictated more by political desperation than strategic wisdom, played directly into Moltke's hands. Prussian intelligence quickly detected the French maneuver, and the German High Command rapidly repositioned their forces to intercept MacMahon's army before it could reach Basing. The army of Chalons, numbering about 130,000 men, began its fateful march on August 21, burdened by supply difficulties and the presence of Napoleon III, whose deteriorating health made him more liability than asset. As the French army moved slowly through the Ardennes region, Prussian forces raced to cut off their line of retreat. Crown Prince Frederick William's Third Army and Prince Frederick Charles's Second Army converged on the small fortress town of Sedan, where MacMahon's forces would soon find themselves trapped in a pocket even more hopeless than Bazin's predicament at Metz. By September 1, 1870, MacMahon's army of Chalons found itself trapped in and around the fortress town of Sedan, surrounded by converging Prussian armies in what would become the most decisive battle of the war. The French occupied low ground in a bend of the Meuse River, with steep hills on all sides, soon to be crowned by German artillery. MacMahon positioned his forces in a defensive perimeter around Sedan, but the tactical situation was hopeless from the outset. During the night of August 31, Prussian and Bavarian artillery pieces were dragged up the surrounding heights, creating a ring of steel that would rain death upon the trapped French army. At dawn on September 1, over 400 German guns opened a devastating barrage that turned Sedan into a killing ground. French attempts to break out were met by concentrated artillery fire and disciplined infantry volleys. MacMahon himself was wounded early in the battle, command passing to General Ducrot, then to General Wimpfen, creating confusion in French leadership at the critical moment. Napoleon III, in constant agony from his kidney ailment, rode among his troops in a desperate attempt to rally them. But courage could not overcome the mathematical impossibility of the French position. By afternoon, with casualties mounting horrifically and no hope of escape, the unthinkable became inevitable. As the bombardment of Sedan reached its crescendo, Napoleon III faced the most humiliating decision in French military history. With his army disintegrating under the relentless German artillery barrage and escape impossible, the emperor who had claimed the mantle of his legendary uncle was forced to contemplate surrender. By mid-afternoon, French casualties had become catastrophic, with thousands of soldiers and civilians crowded into the narrow streets of Sedan under constant shell fire. General Wimpfen made desperate attempts to organize breakout attacks, but these only added to the carnage without achieving any tactical success. Recognizing that further resistance would only result in pointless slaughter, Napoleon III made the agonizing decision to capitulate. At approximately 4 p.m., a white flag was raised over Sedan. The emperor personally wrote a letter to King Wilhelm I of Prussia. "Monsieur mon frère, not having been able to die at the head of my troops, it only remains for me to place my sword in the hands of your majesty." The surrender of Sedan was unconditional, encompassing not only Napoleon III himself, but his entire army of over 100,000 men. The disaster exceeded even Moltke's most optimistic projections and effectively ended the Second French Empire in a single day. News of Napoleon III's capture and the disaster at Sedan reached Paris on September 3, triggering a revolution that swept away the Second Empire in a matter of hours. Crowds gathered in the Place de la Concorde and marched on the Legislative Assembly, demanding the emperor's deposition and the proclamation of a republic. Empress Eugenie, learning of her husband's fate, fled the Tuileries Palace as angry mobs surrounded the imperial residence. By late afternoon, Republican deputies led by Léon Gambetta had proclaimed the Third Republic from the steps of the Hôtel de Ville. A government of national defense was hastily formed under General Louis Trochu, with Gambetta as interior minister and Jules Favre as foreign minister. The new government faced an impossible situation. The capital surrounded by German armies, the emperor imprisoned, one major army trapped at Metz, and another destroyed at Sedan. Despite these overwhelming disadvantages, the Republicans declared their intention to continue the war, appealing to French patriotism and revolutionary tradition. Meanwhile, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was proclaimed German emperor at a ceremony in Versailles, using the palace of French kings as the birthplace of German unity. The war that had begun as a dynastic conflict between Napoleon III and Wilhelm I had become a struggle between the German Empire and the French Republic. With the collapse of imperial authority and the approach of German armies, Paris began transforming itself into a fortress city determined to resist siege. The government of national defense, despite lacking military experience, threw themselves into organizing the capital's defense with revolutionary fervor. General Trochu, the military governor, supervised the construction of extensive fortifications connecting the existing ring of forts around Paris. Barricades appeared in the streets, reminiscent of previous Parisian revolutions, while civilian volunteers joined National Guard units, swelling the garrison to over 400,000 men. However, this massive force was largely untrained and poorly equipped compared to the professional soldiers lost at Sedan and trapped at Metz. The city's population, normally around 2 million, faced the prospect of feeding themselves during a prolonged siege with limited food reserves. Cattle were driven in from the surrounding countryside before German forces could complete their encirclement, and emergency measures were taken to stockpile grain and other necessities. By September 19, 1870, German forces had completely surrounded Paris, beginning what would become one of the most famous sieges in modern history. Moltke's strategy was simple: starve the city into submission while avoiding costly assault operations that would devastate his army unnecessarily. As Paris endured the tightening grip of siege, the drama at Metz reached its tragic conclusion. Marshal Bazaine, with nearly 180,000 troops still under his command, possessed sufficient force to potentially break through German siege lines and march to relieve the capital. However, his increasingly defeatist attitude and questionable negotiations with the Germans sealed his army's fate. Throughout September and October 1870, Bazaine engaged in secret communications with Prussian authorities, ostensibly seeking honorable terms for surrender, while his soldiers grew increasingly desperate from hunger and disease. Several junior officers urged aggressive breakout attempts, but Bazaine consistently refused, claiming such operations would result in unnecessary casualties. By late October, conditions in Metz had become unbearable. Horses were slaughtered for food, soldiers subsisted on reduced rations, and typhus spread through the overcrowded garrison. On October 27, 1870, Bazaine finally capitulated, surrendering his entire army to Prince Frederick Charles. This surrender removed France's last major field army from the war and made Bazaine one of the most reviled figures in French military history. The loss of Metz and its garrison represented an even greater disaster than Sedan, eliminating any realistic hope of French military recovery. With both major French armies eliminated, the burden of continuing resistance fell upon the makeshift forces defending Paris and scattered provincial armies organized by Gambetta, who had dramatically escaped the besieged capital by balloon to coordinate resistance from Tours. The siege of Paris intensified throughout the winter of 1870–1871, creating unprecedented hardship for the city's inhabitants. Food supplies dwindled rapidly, forcing Parisians to consume horses, dogs, cats, and eventually rats to survive. The famous restaurants of Paris served exotic dishes made from zoo animals, including elephants from the Jardin des Plantes. Fuel shortages meant that many buildings were stripped of wood for heating, while the bitter winter made conditions even more desperate. Despite these hardships, Parisian morale remained surprisingly high, sustained by hopes that Gambetta's provincial armies would break the siege. The government of national defense organized several sorties against German lines, most notably the Great Sortie of November 30, where 80,000 Parisians attacked German positions but were repulsed with heavy casualties. Communication with the outside world continued through balloon post and carrier pigeons, maintaining the city's connection to unoccupied France. However, each failed relief attempt and each day of continued starvation made the eventual outcome increasingly inevitable. Gambetta's attempts to organize effective resistance from the provinces faced enormous challenges despite his extraordinary energy and determination. Operating from Tours, then later Bordeaux, the fiery Republican leader worked tirelessly to raise new armies from scratch using conscripts, volunteers, and any remaining regular troops. The Army of the Loire, commanded by General Dorel de Paladins, achieved some initial successes, temporarily recapturing Orleans and raising hopes throughout France. However, these hastily assembled provincial forces lacked the training, equipment, and leadership necessary to face veteran German troops. When Prince Frederick Charles redeployed forces from Metz after Bazin's surrender, the military balance shifted decisively against the French. The Army of the Loire was crushed at the Battle of Loigny-Poupry in December 1870, while other improvised French forces suffered similar defeats across the country. General Bourbaki's Army of the East made a desperate attempt to relieve Belfort, but was driven back to the Swiss frontier, where the entire force was interned by neutral Swiss authorities. Despite Gambetta's heroic efforts and the patriotic sacrifices of countless French citizens, the mathematical realities of modern warfare could not be overcome by revolutionary enthusiasm alone. By January 1871, organized French resistance outside Paris had effectively collapsed. As the Siege of Paris entered its final phase in January 1871, the city's situation became truly desperate. The population, reduced to starvation rations, faced not only hunger, but also increased German bombardment as Prussian artillery began shelling civilian areas to break Parisian morale. The bombardment, which began on January 5, marked a new phase in the siege strategy, targeting hospitals, schools, and residential districts in addition to military installations. Death rates soared from malnutrition and disease, with children and elderly citizens particularly vulnerable. The government of national defense faced growing pressure from both starving citizens and military commanders to seek terms with the Germans. Jules Favre, the foreign minister, entered into preliminary negotiations with Bismarck, but the German terms remained harsh. Massive indemnity payments, territorial cessions in Alsace-Lorraine, and a triumphal march through Paris. On January 19, the garrison attempted one final sortie at Buzenval, hoping to break through German lines and restore French honor. However, this last desperate attack failed like all the others, with over 4,000 French casualties for no territorial gain. With this final military failure, even the most determined Republicans recognized that further resistance would only increase civilian suffering without changing the inevitable outcome of the war. On January 28, 1871, after 130 days of siege, Paris finally surrendered, bringing the Franco-Prussian War to its formal conclusion. Jules Favre signed the armistice with Bismarck at Versailles, agreeing to German terms that would reshape European politics for generations. The armistice conditions were severe. France would pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs, cede Alsace and most of Lorraine to the new German Empire, and accept German occupation of northeastern France until the indemnity was paid. A German victory parade through Paris was also stipulated, adding symbolic humiliation to material losses. The surrender of Paris marked the complete collapse of French military resistance, though scattered fighting continued in some provinces for several more weeks. For Germany, the victory represented the culmination of Bismarck's diplomatic and Moltke's military genius, unifying the German states under Prussian leadership and establishing the German Empire as Europe's dominant continental power. The war's conclusion set in motion forces that would dominate European politics until 1914. German hegemony, French desire for revenge, and the complex alliance systems designed to contain or support the new balance of power. Within weeks of the armistice, however, France would face an even greater internal crisis as the Paris Commune challenged the authority of the new national government. The immediate aftermath of France's defeat unleashed forces that would prove even more destructive than the war itself. Elections held in February 1871 produced a national assembly dominated by monarchists and conservatives. reflecting rural France's exhaustion with war and revolution. However, Paris, which had endured siege and bombardment, remained radical and republican, creating a dangerous political divide. When the new government under Adolphe Thiers attempted to remove cannons from Montmartre that Parisians considered their property, the city erupted in revolution. On March 18, 1871, Parisian workers and National Guard units established the Paris Commune, a radical municipal government that declared independence from the national authority at Versailles. The Commune represented a unique experiment in socialist governance, implementing policies like worker control of abandoned factories, separation of church and state, and universal education. However, it also faced immediate military pressure from Thiers' government, which had relocated to Versailles and began organizing regular troops to retake the capital. Foreign observers watched in fascination and horror as France seemed to tear itself apart just months after defeat by Germany. The Commune's establishment marked the beginning of what would become known as the Bloody Week, a civil war more vicious than the recent conflict with Prussia. The suppression of the Paris Commune in May 1871 provided a savage epilogue to the Franco-Prussian War, as French fought French with a brutality that exceeded anything seen during the German invasion. Thiers' regular army, including troops recently released from German prisoner of war camps, advanced into Paris through breaches in the western fortifications. The Communards, led by figures like Louise Mitchell and Eugene Varlin, fought with desperate courage from barricade to barricade through the narrow streets of eastern Paris. The Bloody Week of May 21–28 witnessed unprecedented urban warfare as government forces systematically recaptured the city district by district. In their final desperation, some communards set fire to public buildings, including the Tuileries Palace and the Hôtel de Ville, creating a symbolic funeral pyre for their revolutionary dreams. The repression was merciless, with government troops executing suspected communards without trial. Estimates suggest that between 10,000 and 20,000 communards were killed during the fighting and subsequent reprisals, far exceeding French military casualties during the entire war against Germany. The Commune's final stand at Père Lachaise cemetery became legendary, with the last defenders shot against the Mur des Fédérés. The brutal suppression ended the immediate revolutionary threat, but created lasting divisions in French society that would persist for generations. The Franco-Prussian War and its aftermath fundamentally transformed Europe, establishing patterns of conflict and alliance that would dominate continental politics until the Great War of 1914. Germany emerged as the dominant European power, with Bismarck's diplomatic skill maintaining the peace while France remained isolated and resentful. The loss of Alsace-Lorraine became an open wound in French national consciousness, ensuring that thoughts of revenge would influence French policy for generations. The war demonstrated the decisive importance of industrial capacity, railway logistics, and modern military organization in determining outcomes between major powers. Prussia's victory validated the German model of universal conscription, professional military education, and rapid mobilization that other European nations would adopt. For France, military defeat and civil war led to profound soul-searching and eventual republican consolidation, but also to a burning desire to reclaim lost territories and national honor. The establishment of the German Empire shifted the European balance of power permanently, contributing to the alliance systems that would divide the continent into hostile camps. The war's lessons influenced military thinking worldwide, while its political consequences helped create the tensions that would eventually explode in 1914. The transformation of Europe's political landscape between 1870 and 1871 thus represents one of history's most decisive turning points. If you like today's story, make sure to check out our other videos on our channel. Have a nice day.